Welcome to the City of Bowie's public hearing on the 2020 to 2025 Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Report. We're going to wait to start about 1 minute just to give people time to log on, and then we will begin the presentation. Thanks for joining us this evening. All right, we are going to get started. This is the first of two public hearings to present the findings of the 2020 to 2025 Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Report for the City of Bowie. We are required to compose this report every 5 years as part of our HUD requirements for our community development block grant programs. Presenting tonight will be Manuel Ochoa and Lisa Sturdivant, who will discuss the findings of the report and their recommendations for the City of Bowie. A recording of this presentation will be available on the city website, and we are encouraging the public to comment over the next 30 days on the findings of the report. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Manuel Ochoa, who will start the presentation.
Great, thank you. So do I need to re-share the screen? I do, right?
Yes, please.
There we go. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present the final analysis of impediments to fair housing choice for the City of Bowie and Prince George's County. My name is Manuel Ochoa, and also on the screen is Lisa Sturdivant from LSA and Associates. So we're glad to be part of the team that has worked on this with the community. So why don't we go ahead and get started, and we'll talk about how we got here, and then we will cover some of our data findings and maps, as well as our recommendations. So the reason why we're doing this is because of the Fair Housing Act, which addresses the refusal to sell housing, negotiate housing, as well as discrimination against for renters, as well as mortgage lending. But the Fair Housing Act is actually more than that. The Fair Housing Act also protects people by what we call protected class, which is disability, race, sex, color, national origin, religion, and family status. The Federal Fair Housing Act, which was the last of the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1968 after the death of Martin Luther King, the Dr. Martin Luther King, provides protections in this area, but Maryland provides further protections listed here, and Prince George's County also offers additional protections, which you can see on the screen, including source of income discrimination, which is new as of October, so coming shortly. This will come into effect. The Fair Housing Act also asks us to affirmatively further fair housing. So besides protecting direct discrimination against people because of national origin, race, etc., the Fair Housing Act also requests that federal agencies also find ways to use federal funding to further fair housing and to eliminate the barriers to discrimination and further integration. So as part of that, the City of Bowie receives the funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development under the Community Development Block Grant. And so every few years, they're asked to complete an analysis of impediments, which you also may have heard of as a fair housing plan, to look at patterns of discrimination, see how funding is used, and also to make recommendations about how to eliminate those barriers to fair housing and make recommendations. So ultimately, this will go to HUD, and HUD will certify that the City of Bowie has analyzed housing discrimination and is working toward its elimination, promote fair housing choice for all, provide racially and ethnically inclusive patterns of housing, promote housing accessibility, especially to persons with disabilities, and promoted and enforced the Fair Housing Act and its related laws and regulations. So as part of this, we looked at the 2012 analysis of impediments to housing choice previously, and also a 2019 update. And what we found from that is that Black and Hispanic households have greater difficulty becoming homeowners because of lower incomes. There were a higher proportion of mortgage denials and high cost lending among minority applicants. There is a inadequate and limited supply of decent and affordable housing, and supply of affordable housing that is limited to persons with disability is also inadequate. Now, I should mention that when we conducted this analysis of impediments, it is for both Prince George's County and the City of Bowie. So we took this all together. So some of these things apply to the City of Bowie, but some of them do not. And we'll talk about that a little further. So these recommendations about listed here are primarily related to the county. And in particular, the main takeaway for the county is a recommendation for enforcement authority in regards to fair housing complaints. So far there's been some progress in different neighborhoods, and some of these laws, because of the relationship between the City of Bowie and the county, particularly areas related to planning, that our recommendations will affect the City of Bowie and its ability to promote fair housing laws. So for example, the City of Bowie has been involved in the comprehensive housing strategy and participating in the Housing Opportunities for All Commission. Some of the challenges that we found were significant unmet needs for housing for persons with disabilities. This is a region-wide problem, but it is more acute. Lisa will talk a little bit more about that, her maps and data. Like everywhere else in our country, there is an increasingly aging population. But again, in the county, we're seeing higher numbers in relationship to other places. A very high rent burden, particularly in a high cost area like the Washington metro region, and limited affordable housing supply for most income levels, at all income levels. And then in particular, potential loss of affordable housing along the Purple Line. So with that, I will turn it over to Lisa to talk about the data. And I'm going to jump ahead, correct, to the residential.
Yeah, thanks, Manuel. We could jump ahead to slide 14 as I sort of set the stage for some of this data analysis. A big part of the analysis of impediments is to look at trends in the demographic data in the City of Bowie as well as in Prince George's County. And in addition to looking at trends in patterns of racial segregation, which I'll talk about in just a minute, we also looked at data on access to housing, to transportation, employment, education, and healthy neighborhoods, and specifically looked at how access to these different amenities and opportunities in the county and the city differ for individuals from those different protected classes that Manuel mentioned. In particular, we took a deep dive into access to opportunities among racial and ethnic minorities, as well as persons with disabilities. We looked at a lot of data for this report, and so given we have a relatively short time, I didn't want to spend too much time going through every data point, but please know that we reviewed a lot of data, and all of that information is available in the draft report that's available for the public to review. I'm going to focus on just a few key findings so that we can spend most of the time tonight talking about what we found in the analysis about ways in which Bowie has worked to address disparities in access to opportunity and access to housing, and to take a look at the additional incentives that could help to ensure that all Bowie residents have access to opportunities. So Manuel has this slide up here on segregation, and one of the key measures and one of the key things that the analysis of impediments focuses on is where people in a community live. And we measure this by this segregation index. And so we calculated this for Prince George's County, for the City of Bowie, as well as for other jurisdictions in the Washington area. Levels of this index above 40 and into the 50s indicate that there's moderate or high levels of segregation, meaning people of different races tend to live in different neighborhoods. And in fact, in Prince George's County, it's the highest level of segregation between white and Hispanic residents, higher than in any other jurisdiction in the region. The Hispanic Black segregation index was also quite high, indicating that in Prince George's County, Hispanic residents and Black residents tend to live very segregated. The Black-White segregation indexes also puts it in the moderate range for Prince George's County. You'll notice the City of Bowie has much lower levels of segregation by this index. It's a little bit of a factor of the fact that Bowie's a smaller geography, but you can see some of those patterns are still consistent, that the Black-White segregation is still sort of in that low level of segregation in the City of Bowie. And then there's also a little bit of disparity in Hispanic and Black residents. On the next slide, we also took a look at what are called racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. These are areas defined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. If we just go back a minute, Manuel, we don't need to proceed on those slides. We look at these because there's research that suggests that when people and families live in areas of concentrated poverty, there are serious ramifications for outcomes and economic outcomes, educational outcomes for individuals and families. And so these recaps are defined, as you can see here, where there is a census tract that is majority non-white and where the poverty rate is greater than 3 times the regional poverty rate. I'm not going to show the maps of the 4 recaps, but there were 4 recaps in the county, no recaps located within the City of Bowie, no areas of the city that met those definitions. When we go to slide 19, we can talk a little bit about what we found when we looked at the population of individuals with disabilities. As Manuel mentioned, there are a number of protected classes, and some of the biggest challenges that the county has been working to address has to do with access to housing among folks with disabilities. This will be a growing population. It's an important part of Bowie's population. You can see on this map, it shows by census tract where there are relatively high numbers of persons with disabilities. The darker color means a greater population. And given the age distribution of the City of Bowie, as well as some of the other underlying demographics, people with disabilities make up a relatively high share, although not as high as in some of the other inside the Beltway neighborhoods, but certainly an important part of Bowie's population. And on the very next slide, another group we wanted to look at was families with children. And it's a similar kind of map where darker colors show on the left-hand map where there are households with children. And again, Bowie is made up of a lot of families with children. The right-hand map dives a little bit deeper and looks at where children are living in poverty. And, you know, compared to some of the neighborhoods inside the Beltway in the county, there are relatively low child poverty rates in the City of Bowie. So if we go ahead to the slide that takes a look at some of the other components that we looked at information beyond demographics. And so we can start talking about some of the data that we found related to access to housing. And so housing cost burden, if we go back just one, Manuel, I'm sorry.
Go. Sorry about that finger.
You're good. We're like one brain almost. We looked at measures of cost burden and particularly severe cost burden. So severe cost burden is when a household spends more than half of their income every month on housing costs. And severe cost burden is always tends to be higher for renters. And in this case, we can also see that severe cost burden is tends to be higher across racial groups for renters and lower for owners. And if we wanted to move on to slides 23, which relates to home ownership, we can see some of the data that Manuel talked about when he mentioned the review of prior housing needs studies. We found that homeownership rates among non-white households tends to be lower than white households. This is true nationally, and we also see that in Prince George's County. You can see that the white homeownership rate is about 77%, and the homeownership rates among Black and Hispanic and Asian households is lower. One interesting finding in the city of Bowie, we find that the homeownership rates among African-American households is actually higher than it is countywide, and the Hispanic homeownership rate is actually pretty close to what the white homeownership rate is in Bowie. And on the next slide, we took a little bit of a deeper dive into how families access homeownership by looking at data on mortgage lending. People apply for home loans every day. Some share of home loans are denied. But what we found is across the board that denial rates were much higher for non-white applicants than for white applicants. And you can see the blue bar is Prince George's County, the orange bars are the city of Bowie, and the green bars are Maryland. And while mortgage lending denial rates are higher for non-whites in the city of Bowie as well, they're somewhat lower for Black applicants. Though somewhat higher for Hispanic applicants, which suggests that for those populations, access to homeownership is still a challenge. We looked at transportation and employment. I'm going to skip over those topics just for now so that we can focus a little bit more on issues related to poverty. And on the next slide, we see, took a closer look at some of the characteristics of the neighborhoods of city residents and county residents. What we know is true, both from our own experience as well as from research, is that where you live has a tremendous impact on your ability to access good jobs, good schools, the ability really for individuals and families to thrive. One measure of that is if for folks who live in low poverty neighborhoods, outcomes tend to be much better for individuals and families. And we can see that the average neighborhood poverty level in the city of Bowie is much lower than the average neighborhood level poverty rate in Prince George's County overall. But in general, people who are non-white tend to live in census tracts or neighborhoods with higher levels of poverty. Folks who are disabled also tend to live in somewhat higher poverty neighborhoods. And so those are some of the data that we looked at to kind of look at where there might be disparities in access to opportunity. Finally, just turning to the slide 37, this environmentally healthy neighborhoods. If we look at the next slide, we took a look at a range of characteristics of neighborhood that might be a little bit different than demographic or economic characteristics, but that where we know there is a correlation between those characteristics and the well-being of individuals and families. And we looked at crime rates on the left, and we looked at the presence of liquor stores, which has been shown through research to be highly correlated with youth violence and youth crime and disconnection from schooling. Crime rates tend to be higher inside the Beltway in Prince George's County. In the city of Bowie proper, crime rates tend to be very low. Same too with the presence of liquor stores, and the correlation between crime and higher poverty neighborhoods is much more evident in the county than the city. I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Manuel, who's going to talk a little bit about what how we took all this data on conditions on the ground and what we've seen the city and county do to try and create more opportunities for folks, and then finally to review the recommendations in the report. So Manuel, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. So as you know, as I mentioned earlier, we take all the data, and it's both for the county and the city. We looked at the previous fair housing plans that the City of Bowie also did in conjunction with Prince George's County, and came up with the top fair housing issues, which you can see here. So these fair housing issues are for both. And our top issue was related to inadequate fair housing enforcement. The county has their Human Relations Commission, which currently does not have the authority. That's something that they've been working on, which I mentioned earlier. And this is a really our top recommendation, because they can also assist through areas of the county, and would work directly with HUD once they receive that authority, and receive that permission from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's a certification that they receive to investigate fair housing issues enforcements across the county. The other big issue is related to limited fair housing choice for persons with disability. There's frankly just not enough housing that's available. There's not enough accessible housing. And we also found that there are difficulties for disabled persons to be able to either talk to their landlords about making reasonable accommodations, or the fact that persons with disabilities who are also living in poverty, or low income rather, do not have the means to make these reasonable accommodations. So that is this is one of the largest issues that we found. We also found that Hispanic residents face persistent housing challenges. This we found primarily around the Purple Line corridor, Langley Park, Tacoma area, and many Hispanic residents, some families who are not documented, do not have access to some of the county programs that are CDBG funded. They don't have access to down payment assistance programs, and they also face a host of code enforcement issues for which needs additional attention. We found that there were insufficient funding for nonprofits, limited homeownership options for subgroups of county and city residents. And then we also found the need for affordable housing for vulnerable populations, particularly seniors, as well as disabled, which I mentioned. And then the access to high quality neighborhoods is limited. Of course, we would characterize that the City of Bowie itself is probably we would consider a high quality city, a high quality neighborhood. And there have been many steps that the City of Bowie has taken around their redevelopment efforts to make that accessible to others from the region who want to move to the City of Bowie. So we found in our goals, as part of our process, we take these fair housing issues that we've identified, we take the data, and then we also come up with reasonable goals in consultation with the public on improving fair housing access. The first goal is increasing awareness of fair housing rights and responsibilities, continuing the fair housing education program. In this case, this is an area where the City of Bowie has been a leader, and the City of Bowie organizes fair housing education throughout the year. They also provide training to area municipalities, and the City of Bowie has actually become a go-to place for fair housing education and resources. The second major goal for the City of Bowie is providing greater opportunities for a range of housing types. The City of Bowie has been looking at implementing a moderately priced dwelling unit or inclusionary zoning program for some time. Because they lack the zoning authority, they have to wait for Prince George's County to pass inclusionary zoning, which is currently underway. So that's been one of the top recommendations from the Housing Opportunities for All Commission, which the City of Bowie has been involved in, and that is moving ahead. So once that becomes that's passed by the county, that will provide the opportunity for the City of Bowie to also pass its own program. But meanwhile, the City of Bowie is not waiting, and there have been, I believe, up to 2 developments where they have worked with the developers to negotiate for moderately priced dwellings. Most recently, the redevelopment of the Sears site at the Bowie Town Center was a successful negotiation of the inclusionary zoning. So those are great steps that are taking place in the interim. So we think it's important to note, just to mention, that when we allocate resources, and the Community Development Block Grant Program really is the most flexible funding that can be used for so many different types of activities, whether they're public services, like feeding the elderly, or helping the homeless, or facade improvements in redevelopment areas. But also, so we look at, those are more place-based strategies, investments in particular places. And the city of Bowie has done that in the past in particular neighborhoods, if I recall, in the northern part of the city. So those are one kind of strategies. The other ones are so-called like people strategies. So those are helping individuals and families out of poverty, and give them better access to schools or better jobs. So they could be after school programs, or workforce housing programs or training programs. So and so those are more the mobility strategies, to try to give people access to places of greater opportunity. And I always like this slide. It's a baseball, because of course we are in baseball season. And so this is a good way to kind of end and talk about the difference between equality and equity. And as you can see on the left, we have a couple of people there, maybe a family of different heights, the dad and the big brother and the little brother. They're all on equal footing, but of course, on those boxes that are the same height, but of course the little guy can't see over the fence, and that's equality. But does that really get us to where we want to go, which is making sure that everyone gets to where they need to be successful, as you can see, which is really what equity is about. So the picture on the right, and of course now the little guy can see the baseball game. And that's ultimately what the goal of the Fair Housing Plan, and to move us toward better integration of neighborhoods. And of course today that's more important than ever, particularly given the unrest that our nation has faced, and given manifest the racial inequalities that exist in our nation. So this is one way, it's a small way, but an important way to address some of those issues. So here are our next steps here. The public comment period is now open, which was for 30 days, which will be until October the 23rd. And you'll see the link, which has been provided here on the slide. I believe that Kay is also going to provide the link in the chat, and I will turn it over to Kay to say some more about how people can make comments related to the analysis of impediments.
Thank you, Manuel and Lisa. Yes, so the draft AI report can be downloaded from that link. And then if you have public comments, you can email bowiehsg@cityofbowie.org, or you can write a letter to City Hall addressed to me, and we will incorporate those comments into the final report. And at the moment, I don't see any questions from attendees. So is there anything else that Manuel or Lisa would like to add?
I think that covers everything. Thank you for the opportunity to present today to the City of Bowie.
And we will also have one more public hearing on this at a city council meeting, and that information will also be available on the website. So with that, I'm going to close out the presentation unless there are any other comments from anyone. I do not see any. Right, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and we look forward to your comments on the report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Manuel. Thanks, Lisa.